well, what can we do just outside of the city, like right outside of the building department's jurisdiction into somebody else's jurisdiction who might be a smaller city who might be more open to attracting a different type of development that aligns maybe more with the state or international building codes rather than New York City specific concerns.
How do we crack open the East Coast market for mass timber and get more developers saying yes to building with it? Today's guest, Kristin Slavin, brings powerful insights and a rare 360-degree perspective. She's the founder of Conifer Advising and has been deep in the mass timber game for over a decade, working across the US and Canada with teams on the architecture, developer, GC, and manufacturing side. From early work with Kaiser and Path to roles at Sidewalk Labs and Intelligent City, Kristen now helps owners and developers navigate the mass timber journey, spotting issues before they derail projects and unlocking smarter, faster paths to success. In this episode, Kristen and I dig into the cultural, business, and regulatory dynamics shaping East versus West Coast mass timber adoption, the evolving role of prefabrication in mass timber from panelized to hybrid systems, and how AEC teams can better communicate with developers and owners, shifting the conversation to what really matters to them. If you're trying to figure out what's next for mass timber and how to get more projects across the finish line, this conversation with Kristen is packed with strategy and perspective. But a quick heads up before we get into it. If you're serious about mass timber and want to learn from leading experts, plus meet future partners in person, the Mass Timber Group Summit is happening this August in Denver. Early bird pricing is ending soon, so now's your time to grab your spot. And as a podcast listener, you can use code PODCAST, all caps, to save $50 at masstimber.group. So with that, let's get into it.
I'm Kristin Slavin. I am the founder and mass timber expert at Conifer Advising. My background is in architecture, development, construction, and manufacturing of mass timber elements.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Kristen. I really appreciate it. You and I connected, I think, on LinkedIn to kind of talk about some of the things that are happening right now, your new venture in the mass timber world. But we kind of wanted to focus this conversation on like what's happening on the East Coast compared to what's happening on the West Coast, and like where do you see the future in that? So can we kick off the conversation there?
Yeah, so I started my career on the West Coast, as many in mass timber in the United States did. It's where everything was started and kind of took off. And the projects that I did there and how that kind of got started was really in a very grassroots way. The projects I was doing was with a very small develop, design, build company, Kaiser Path, and the other firms that were working on mass timber projects were firms like Lever and Anile Halova. She was leading the development project in Portland there, but it was very kind of like small developer led grassroots projects. What I'm seeing on the East Coast is very different right now. It's lagged a bit from the West Coast just because of building code adoption, resource availability, things like that. But what I'm seeing here is sort of a more standard maybe adoption of new technology, which is that it's starting in institutions, in schools and universities, in some cases the government, and kind of you know trickling down from there. So starting with public work primarily or institutional work, and then working its way into private development. I do think that there's a big cultural difference between the West Coast and the East Coast, as anyone who's lived in both places knows. But there's a big business cultural difference as well, and I think that's kind of playing out in how we see mass timber being adopted here on the East.
So let's talk about the business differences first, I guess. Like, are you talking more on like the mass timber business side of thing or like business in general?
No, mass timber is pretty consistent. Like the companies that I know on the East Coast or up in Canada, West Coast, everyone's really collaborative and open. I think it's more of a general business practice that's different here. New York City in particular is huge and old, and there's a lot of bureaucracy, and there's a lot of big players here, and there's a lot of older kind of ways of doing work and business because they've been around for longer. Whereas the West Coast is more, I guess, innovative, or they're just trying to do things a little bit differently, generally speaking. And there's less barriers to that, I would say, from the government perspective. The biggest hurdle right now that we're seeing in New York City is really with the building code and in particular with the fire department. And that's, I think, fairly true across the East Coast. There are definitely jurisdictions that are picking it up mass timber code, they're educating, their building departments and their fire departments, and it's starting to come through, especially in places like Boston, DC a little bit. But it's just an older, bigger place to work, and so it's just kind of manifesting a little differently.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So where do you see kind of like the biggest opportunity for mass timber right now? Like recognizing that, hey, they do business differently. The code adoption might be a little different than the West Coast, but it's like, where do you see mass timber like really plugging in and fitting into the East Coast?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think it is starting with institutions, company or not companies, educational entities like Princeton are really going heavy with mass timber right now, pushing it forward. I do think that within private development, there is sort of an upswelling of interest on just on the outskirts of these bigger cities, and again, in particular, New York, where I'm based. There's interest within the city, but a lot of discussions that I'm hearing are, well, what can we do just outside of the city? Like, right outside of the building department's jurisdiction into, somebody else's jurisdiction who might be a smaller city who, might be more open to attracting a different type of development, that aligns maybe more with the state or international building codes rather than, New York City specific concerns. So there are a lot of projects that I'm hearing about kind of just on the outskirts, and it might actually kind of start from a private development standpoint, kind of working its way into the city. But I do think that as soon as there are some projects that have been successfully built under the existing codes, both in New York City, but also the more progressive codes kind of in surrounding areas, we'll start to see that change here more rapidly.
Are, are you seeing a specific like use type for these buildings coming out of the private side?
A lot of housing. There's just a huge need for housing. So multifamily housing in particular, mid-rise building range, typical with what you would see on um, at least on the West Coast with regard to code adoption. So between that kind of 6, 8 to 18-story range. Here, it's more dense. So there's less restrictions on height. In Portland, there's a lot of 5/1s because of zoning code. Here in New York, there's a lot more density, and taller buildings and just a different zoning code. So in a lot of ways, zoning isn't really the restrictor here as much as, the building code is. So, yeah, I think a lot of sort of that, here maybe it's more like 12 to 15, 18-story range, housing. That's partially, I think, just due to the market, office hasn't really come back fully yet since COVID and, people are working more remotely. There's a huge need for housing of all different types, here, well, everywhere in the United States. Um, and it's something that is very repeatable. It kind of aligns well with a lot of the ethos of mass timber where you're trying to, go into a more repeatable methodology and prefab things more, get more coordination offsite, and housing is really well aligned for that.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Are there any projects that you've kind of touched or worked with recently that kind of like exemplify a lot of the things that we just talked about?
Yeah, when I was finishing up my time in Intelligent City, we were just going into fabrication on a project in Toronto, and I know it's not the US, but it is still kind of the East Coast or Midwest. And that's a 9-story, fully prefabricated structure envelope system, and that is really, I think, indicative of what we'll see in the next few years here. It's mid-rise infill housing, very repeatable floor plate, prefabbed as much as, it could be, and they're trying to take advantage of all the systems that mass timber enables within prefab to really kind of amplify the time savings in particular on that project.
And when you're talking about prefab, we can go panelized, modular, hybrid, kind of like where are you seeing like prefab in general with the mass timber industry sitting right now?
I just sat on a panel at the International Mass Timber Conference, and I was surprised by the amount of volumetric prefab, or volumetric modular that I was seeing, and the other 3 panelists on the panel were talking primarily about volumetric, although they do have, panelized systems as well that they've worked with or that they're developing. I think that's kind of coming it's a bit more of a European style perhaps, the volumetric modular approach. I think that in the US at scale and in Canada at scale, a flat packed prefab approach is likely a lot more suitable, both just because the country or continent is huge relative to, Germany, say. So shipping it becomes a really big deal here, and we ship a lot of almost everything to the continent by truck rather than train. So I do think that some of those kind of drivers will change, the way that it gets implemented in the US. But I also think that there's a lot of flexibility with prefab, with flat pack prefab that you get that sometimes volumetric doesn't really allow you to have with as far as, maximizing the site or coming up with maybe some forms of the building that aren't quite a rectangle, or something like that. So, I do think that the prefab will allow for the flexibility that designers here are used to seeing, with projects generally, while also taking advantage of the sort of prefabricated aspect or pre-coordinated higher quality aspects of those systems.
So you talked about like kind of like the geography of North America versus like various countries in Europe. Do you think that volumetric mass timber will be more prevalent, maybe say like in the Northwest, where like these producers and stuff can like ship to these bigger markets like pretty close, versus say like the Southeast, where there's like just a handful of mass timber players, and that might be more panelized? Do you see any like distribution like that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's not actually something I've really considered specifically before, but it does seem to make sense. There are a number of manufacturers in the Pacific Northwest that are doing volumetric and shipping to that general market. I actually think the Southeast has a big opportunity for volumetric as well. I think probably the bigger differentiator between volumetric and prefab has to do with building code and what you're able to do as far as stacking things. So when you're thinking about volumetric, modular, using mass timber, you're relying on the mass timber walls and things like that to create the structure of the modules, and you're stacking them together and connecting them to make a bigger a building. I think that's fairly limited in the scale that it could achieve. I don't think you're gonna go 18 stories with a mass timber modular building, but you can go 18 stories with a flat pack prefab system, which is often almost always combined with other systems that exist on the market as well. So, I think that it's actually the markets it will serve, you're right, it probably is tied a bit to the supply and location just because of the shipping issue. The Southeast does have the supply and is building the supply pretty well, but they also have lower scale buildings, I would say, than like the Northeast of the US or, LA maybe, or, other places that have potentially a need for that infill at scale at height that then, some of the smaller areas, cities do.
Yeah, totally. That makes a lot of sense. Do you So looking at the East to West Coast, we talked about kind of like the difference in business practices, and then panelized, volumetric, modular, et cetera. Uh, is there any like sweet spots when you go like East to West about like where you think like it might be being overlooked a little bit right now that in the future might play like a bigger market share in this mass timber industry?
Yeah, I just attended a really interesting symposium or gathering from the Great Lakes region. So it was all of the states that touched the Great Lakes, kind of, Wisconsin, Michigan, all the way out to New York. And they were talking about how they could play a role in the mass timber ecosystem. And there's obviously been some pretty groundbreaking work in the Midwest related to mass timber with the Ascent project, and some others that are on the books right now. But the manufacturing is still happening in the Pacific Northwest, across Canada, and the Southeast. And what I found really interesting about the whole conversation was that it was being led by a developer out of, from BlackRock, which is a very progressive, big developer in Detroit, and a professor from the University of Michigan talking about, hey, how can we start to participate in this value chain? And um, they all recognize that the wood basket in the Midwest is very different than the wood basket that you get in Pacific Northwest or Southeast. They have a lot more hardwoods, and the wood there is used for different stuff. There is some research happening related to hardwood CLT that, we'll see where that goes and if that becomes commercialized. But the reality is that hardwoods also have other use cases. Like we use oak for so many different things, flooring, cabinets, other materials that we don't want to give up, and it's not likely that those materials will go into CLT panels cost effectively, um, even if the structure is amazing, right? So they were talking a lot about the low value hardwoods that they have, and could those be used for CLT panels? But more importantly, they have a massive manufacturing base and they have all of this infrastructure for manufacturing, all of this knowledge around manufacturing. And I think there's a really big value proposition to think about sort of maybe a bit more of a distributed system than we have today where, they could take, the blanks, the raw panels from the manufacturers all over and actually do some really amazing value add manufacturing to get to that next level of prefab, or fabrication of the CLT panels or whatever it is that projects need, in particular in that region, but really kind of feeding, everywhere, kind of out from the middle of the US there. So I think there's an interesting potential for that region to really kind of, fill a different role than what's typically talked about with mass timber opportunity in manufacturing. It's, usually you're thinking about making the panels or the glue lams or the wood fiber itself, using that in some way. But I think they've really honed in on and recognized this potential for the additive processes.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think a lot of times when I'm talking to different people about, setting up new manufacturing facilities or what have you, like it generally starts with like, hey, a cut shop, or, maybe you're partnering with somebody that does the the panel manufacturing, and then they send it to a cut shop, and then or vice versa. And so it's like you don't have to go all in and build, $100 million facility to participate in the side of the industry. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, what do we have that we're really good at? This manufacturing base, like, well, let's just take in these billets. And I think that could also open up um, back to that prefab side of things. Like if you can get a system set up where you're just taking in a bunch of blank billets, you're fabricating this prefab system, whether that's panelized or modular or whatever, like that also opens up in a new part of the ecosystem, that even if you're not manufacturing the actual billets in your region due to your wood basket, like you can still be a major participant in it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big advantages that mass timber has over other types of construction is that it's, I don't know if it's exactly why, but it's a much more collaborative type of building than I've experienced, with steel or concrete buildings. And so I think if we can kinda look at the nation and say like, "Okay, this is like this region is already set up for certain things, like, let's use that." And maybe it's in the case of, like, the Rust Belt and things like that, like, a lot of jobs have been pulled away from there. A lot of manufacturing is left, right? So what can we do to bring that back and use the infrastructure and the knowledge that exists in those places to add to this very collaborative process and distribute the value a little bit better than, other systems. Concrete is made all over the place, right? But it's not the same culture as as mass timber is generally on the job site, and I think that is, in large part due to the prefabricated nature and needing everything to be really coordinated because everything's gonna be, really within a few millimeters tolerance and things like that, so, everyone kinda has to work together and is also learning at the same time. Like, this industry is still pretty new in the US. It's 10, 11, 12 years old at this point. That's when I started working in it, was 2014. So, 11 years ago, right? And that was like working on the first project at scale that got built with mass timber. So we're still learning a lot. There's an opportunity for everyone to contribute right now and really kind of feed into this environment that is being built.
Absolutely. What if we're talking about like the East Coast being quote unquote newer to this mass timber things, the adoptions, et cetera? If you were talking to, let's say, designers or architects that are, standing on one side of the fence, they're looking over at it, they're saying, "Oh, I see mass timber, I'm interested in it, but for whatever reason, my firm isn't working on it yet, or I'm trying to get into it." Like, what would be your advice for those folks that are on that East Coast?
Every architect I talk to is interested in it.
Yes.
No one doesn't wanna try something new, try something more sustainable, more collaborative, more innovative. It's I don't think it's a lack of will on the design side, right? There might be a bit of a lack of understanding or knowledge, like, where do I get this information? There's organizations for that, like Woodworks, who can help with technical, feedback on projects to some extent. But ultimately, it is what is I think what they need to understand is, what is the value that this is bringing to the project that the developer cares about? Because ultimately, it's the developer or the owner, whoever is holding the purse, right, for the project, and also the debt, and also the insurance, and, like, all these other things that they have to deal with. What is the value to them for using this material when in their minds it might be really just easier to use the same material they're using over and over again? So I think the creative industry around building is pretty on board and pretty interested. They're just not quite sure how to sell the value, and part of that's because they have never used it before and don't quite know the value, right? I had an interesting conversation recently with somebody who was saying, what are the risks associated with kind of being the first in something or doing something new? That's really scary and hard, and there are certainly risks associated with it. And oftentimes, those projects don't get you the return you want and things like that. But the other side of it was like, well, what's the risk of not doing that? What's the risk of not trying something new and not innovating and not staying ahead of your competition and doing things the same old way when the labor industry is pretty strapped right now, so prices are really high. You know that we have a carbon issue, and you know that everyone else is building the same thing, so how do you differentiate yourself? So I think there's this question of, like, risk and value and really the designers need to put themselves a little bit more into the developer's shoes and understand what their problems are so that they can help address them.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I heard you I kinda wanted to unpack a little bit of those, like, benefits from the developer's standpoint. So I heard we talk about, like, labor market risk, right? Carbon pricing, market differentiation, stuff like that. Like, are those kinda like the 3 core things that you're talking to or hearing about from the developer side of thing, or are there other talking points?
I think there's additional stuff, like schedule is a big one, not just the labor side, of course, which is a huge, constraint right now, I think nationwide probably, but also just schedule. There's as we saw over the last couple days, there's a lot of fluctuation in the markets. So, if you can get a project to market faster, then you can get it into a market that is more predictable. So I do think that there's a big value in the time savings associated with mass timber, which is prefabricated by nature to some extent. Or if you want to take it further with a full prefab building, it's maybe hard to quantify at first, but I think if you can start to look at, all right, what is the market I'm selling into? And if it's only 18 months away instead of 36 months away, like I can probably predict 18 months out much better than I can predict 36 months out. So from the developer's perspective, there's a risk associated with schedule and delays and things like that. I think there's also a quality and sort of reputational benefit if you can build a building that's within 3 millimeters tolerance, kind of all the way around, and you know what you're going to get, and it's very predictable. The performance will be better. Air tightness in the building, things like that will be better if things are in the right place, and you won't have as much conflict on site. So, from an end user point of view, they should be, experiencing a better building, not even talking about the biophilia of the of the mass timber, but just the building itself is built the way it was supposed to be built. And so, I think there's a reputational benefit to developers who can really lean on that and say, like, look, we build good buildings. We're doing good work here. We have a good product.
Totally. And so we're picking on designers a little bit, but do you think that like the meat and potatoes of this conversation with developers rests on the design team, or do you think that maybe the GC or the structural guys or whoever fit more into that conversation than maybe we're talking about?
Everybody fits into it, everybody. Just there's not one person or one entity or one role that needs to get more on board than the others. Everyone needs to kinda come to the table and be open and really understand, like, this is the goal. How do we get there? Um, the GCs obviously play a huge role in how effective it will be because they're controlling the site, they're controlling the subs that they pick. They do need to work with subs who are also more open to doing things maybe a different way. But for them, there's also benefits. There's a shift in risk to some extent because if you're prefabricating more, you're pushing risk and warranty onto the prefabricator. And so something that you might have to like cobble together on site typically and take the risk for is being dealt with, by maybe one entity. So for them, there's an advantage there. And also they can schedule their subs with greater certainty with regard to schedule and faster so that they can actually, um, you know, guarantee or to some extent guarantee their subs more consistent, faster work, and that will help keep them on your site rather than going to someone else's site. So, yeah, I think everyone needs to kind of, again, like, come to the table pretty open and understand what their value creation could be in that process and how that gets not just passed along to the developer, but how do they gain from it and how do the designers gain from it? Um, and I don't wanna, like, I don't wanna say I'm picking on the designers. I'm a designer, I'm an architect. But I think that there's, in some ways, like, they're open. They wanna do this. They're very interested. They're creative people. They're interested in the wood. They know it makes you feel better when you're in it. They know it's better for the end user. But it's just kind of understanding how to get over that gap that's maybe a struggle.
Yeah, yeah, and I totally agree with everything you're saying. It's like I have yet to run into an architect who says I don't know about this mass timber stuff. I don't ever talk about it. It's generally like no, I talk about it all the time. It's maybe the person holding the purse, like you said, that's like well, I got to pay for this. I got to take on the risk. I'm not ready to do that yet. So I think it's like those tools for client conversations is like maybe something that we as an industry can be a little bit more focused on. It's like, hey, the person that's ultimately paying for this is the one that's going to make the decision. How do we speak in their language, the benefits that they're going to receive from it? Especially if you're looking at something that's like cost par plus a little bit, right? Like they're gonna want to
Yeah.
see some real tangible benefits to one, pay a smidge more in some cases, but then also to go into the unknown, right? If it's unknown for them.
Yeah.
Um, if you were, I'm gonna change topics a little bit here. I asked you about, hey, if you were talking to a designer on the East Coast, it's new, etc. So you're seeing a lot of like the big players in the industry, from GCs to designers to whatever. Like, they might be West Coast based, but they're doing projects kind of like all over, right? From East Coast to West Coast, North to South. One of the things that I think about a lot, and it's not based in facts or evidence, it's just Brady doing some deductive reasoning. It's like the more different firms that are participating in this, the better the adoption, et cetera. But sometimes like these quote unquote smaller firms might be a little bit more limited in maybe time, capacity, resources, just sheer number of projects that come across their desk, et cetera. How do you think that more AEC firms in general on the East Coast start participating in mass timber and start like building up that experience and track record like we have on the West Coast? Like what do you think needs to happen, or firms need to focus on to kind of like get more people into this pie?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's funny that you say that the smaller firms, might have fewer, maybe less influence or fewer opportunities for that, right? Because my experience is actually the opposite. When I was working at Kaiser Path, we were only 7 people. We were doing develop, design, and construction with 7 people, and it was tiny. We were so small. We were working on one block for the entire time that I was there for 6 years. So it's multiple projects, but one block. And but the advantage to being small was that we could talk really, openly. Um, an advantage obviously was that we were holding the purse. So we were the developer. We were also the architect and GC, and we did have to answer to to our investors and to the banks. But we could make decisions quickly. We could be really nimble. We could make aligned decisions within the small team very quickly and make sure that everyone was on board. And then we could also fly under the radar to some extent. We applied for the Tallwood Building grant that the U.S. Forest Service put out in 2014 and did not win for Carbon 12, and we built it anyway because we had a project. Like, we had convinced ourselves that this was a good project. And we sort of thought, like, you know what? Maybe not having government funding for this project is actually better because we can, like, go through this, be small, make mistakes, figure it out, and be nimble and get it done in a way that you wouldn't be able to do with, like, a big, kind of spotlight on you. And that's how it worked out. We worked through it. We worked with the state and the city, and we got it done. And the two projects that were funded ended up not happening for a variety of reasons. And so I think there actually is a lot of power in being small because you can get consensus a lot easier within your own company. Whereas large corporations, they are like, there are so many levels to them. You have to convince so many people that this is a good idea that it might actually slow it down. So I would say to small companies, like, you have the flexibility and you can be nimble enough to actually make this work if if you're trying hard enough. But that said, like, it's very risky. There's only so many projects, like you said, right? So you have to make it a success. I do think that one way that the East Coast designers and the AEC companies have and will continue to kind of gain the knowledge that they need to have the confidence to kind of, continue this at scale is through partnership. It's the way that often teams come together to do a project that they maybe a market that they're interested in that they don't have a track record in. They'll partner with another firm that has that and learn from them and kind of split the scope until they get the knowledge that they need to make that work. But that's what I'm working on right now. I am running a consulting company. We are partnering with the owners, design teams, GCs, etc., to help kind of hold their hand through the process and get them the resources that they need to make this successful. And it is allowing us to actually bring in smaller companies who, might not have the overhead resources to just do a bunch of research on mass timber, the ability to start to participate in mass timber projects without that burden. To some extent. So it's partnerships, it's being open, learning from others. There's firms that are kind of bi-coastal. Those are, great companies to start to look for, where they're kind of bringing in their West Coast experts on the East Coast teams to help bolster the knowledge. But I think that's probably the best way.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with all that. And you kind of breezed over it, but like in your new firm that you're working with, or that you are working with other firms with, like where do you generally come in on that conversation? Are you like, hey, we're talking like, you know, just a design concept? Are they like, hey, we're moving into DD? Like where do they need to reach out and contact Kristen?
I am talking to people as they're doing feasibility studies or even before. And so they, and it's owners. And I'm sitting typically on the ownership side because there's more value that I'm bringing than just design assist, right? If I were just doing architectural kind of mass timber architecture assistance, then maybe I could sit under the architect from a contractual standpoint, but I'm able to help the developer more if I'm sitting with them because I can help with the design stuff, I can help with the supply chain stuff, I can connect them to suppliers who they might not even know about and help them get quotes with the GC that they wouldn't have otherwise gotten. We can talk through things like prefabrication and what that does to their bottom line, how that impacts schedule, what does that mean for underwriting, what does it mean for insurance, all of that, right? So that's kind of typically I'm being brought in very early, specifically because they want to get off on the right foot, which is when it makes sense. They're often looking at insurance policies and things like that before they really have a lot of the design done. So they need to understand these decisions early. It's also where the most value is because if you can get the project set up correctly and kind of share the knowledge early, then you have a lot less rework to do. There's a lot less BEing down the road, and just a much higher chance of success that the project will move forward as originally designed rather than as, BE'd out later and redesigned.
Yeah, that also makes a ton of sense. Like if you're working with the ownership team, like you're kind of starting at ground zero, and it's like, hey, if something comes up that you can see based on your experience, like, hey, this we're gonna have to do some rework or something 5 6 months down the road. Like let's just fix it now rather than coming in and saying and pointing out the problem that needs to be fixed. You just avoid it altogether. Yeah, I like that approach a lot. Uh, so what's next for you? Like, what are you focused on over the next 1 2 3 years? Like, what would you like to see happen?
Man, I would love to see mass timber become more mainstream on the East Coast. It's where I live. It's the market that I am in, and it's the place I care about right now the most because I'm here and I would love to get to a project by train and go do a site walk, that would be great. Um, so that's what I would like to see. I am, actively working on some projects that are spanning the nation. Certainly open to anything because, like I said, you'll continue to learn if you work with folks from the West Coast doing West Coast projects, because they're a bit ahead of the East Coast. So I'm, trying to stay involved across, but I would love to see more projects on the East Coast, reaching out early for help to make sure that their mass timber projects are executed successfully.
Yeah, I love that. I got before I ask my last question, if somebody wanted to reach out and tap into your expertise on the owner side of things, where can they contact you?
Yeah, you can hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on there, so I should be able to get back to you within a few days. Or you can go to my website at coniferadvising.com. There's a contact me page. And if you are a developer and you just want to have like a 1 hour work session, there's also a way to just schedule that directly on the website. So, yeah, reach out through those two channels and I'll get back to you.
All right. And I'll make sure to link both of those down below for everybody that's listening. All right. Last question. If you had somebody trapped in an elevator for 30 seconds and they had to say, what the heck is this mass timber thing on the East Coast? Where's it going? How do we get there? What would you tell them?
I would say that there's a huge opportunity to use mass timber to build the buildings that we know we need over the next 100 years on the East Coast. In particular, housing that is needed now, but over the long run, really any building type that could benefit from a more repeatable, more sustainable building methodology that is also more collaborative. And that if they're interested, they should be open to having a collaborative discussion, a collaborative team, and that sort of ethos is really critical to making mass timber a success.
All right. I love it. That's a great answer. So, well, thank you for joining me, Kristen. Thanks for kind of unpacking the East and West Coast, where we're going, and some prefab stuff and kind of tools for client conversations on the developer side. I enjoyed our conversation and I learned a lot. And I look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Thank you.